The instruction was clear. Play a simple waltz, keep your head down, and collect your 3 shillings. But the piano was out of tune. The room smelled of stale gin and expensive hypocrisy, and frankly, she was just too tired to be invisible anymore. So she changed the key. The servants' entrance of the Carlyle estate smelled strictly of damp wool and boiled cabbage. Florence stood in the narrow corridor, leaning her weight against the cold plaster wall, trying to scrape the London mud from the heel of her boot, or for using the edge of the stone step. Her stockings were wet. They had been wet since she crossed Piccadilly an hour ago, and the chill had long since settled into the marrow of her shins. She rubbed her hands together. The friction did little to warm them. Her fingers were stiff, the joints aching with the familiar, dull throb that preceded a long night of playing. Beside her, Martin, the cellist, was quietly cursing as he tried to replace a snapped string in the dim light of a single tallow candle. 3 shillings, Florence muttered to herself, staring at her own red, chafed knuckles. Just remember the 3 shillings. Herrick, the ensemble leader, bustled into the corridor. He was a man who perpetually sweated, regardless of the season, his collar wilting under the strain of his own anxiety. He smelled of cheap pomade and old cigars. "Listen to me, all of you," Herrick hissed, waving a rolled-up sheet of music like a baton. This is the Duke of Carlisle's ballroom. The floor is imported cedar. The guests are the most insufferable, easily offended aristocrats in the city. They do not want a concert. They want background noise. Florence. Florence looked up, her expression flat. "Yes, Herrick. No flourishes. No heavy left hand. Just the waltz. Keep the tempo steady. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. If they speed up their dancing, you speed up. If they slow down, you slow down. You are a metronome with hair. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice dry. She adjusted the cuffs of her dress. The gown was a faded navy silk, bought second-hand from a pawnbroker in Cheapside. The whalebone corset beneath it was warped, the rigid boning digging a sharp, persistent point of pressure into her lower ribs every time she took a deep breath. She didn't care about the pain. She cared that the dress made her look acceptable enough to be allowed in the room, but plain enough to be ignored. They filed up the narrow, twisting servants' stairs and emerged into the blinding glare of the ballroom. The heat hit Florence first. It was a physical wall, thick with the scent of melting beeswax from hundreds of tapers in the crystal chandeliers overhead. Beneath the wax was the suffocating perfume of the crowd, heavy rosewater, musk, sour wine, and the underlying unavoidable scent of unwashed bodies masked by expensive powder. Florence kept her eyes on the floor as she navigated through the velvet-draped periphery toward the raised dais where the instruments waited. She slid onto the piano bench. It creaked loudly, a sharp wooden protest that was instantly swallowed by the roar of 300 conversations. The instrument was a grand broadwood. Florence ran a thumb over the edge of the wood casing. It was immaculate. She lifted the lid and pressed middle C. The key was heavy, the ivory slightly yellowed but smooth. The note rang out, a fraction flat. A piano worth more than she would earn in a lifetime, left to fall out of tune because no one in this house actually cared about music. They only cared about owning the thing that made it. Florence let out a slow breath, feeling the corset bite into her rib. She looked out at the room. It was a sea of shifting silk and broadcloth. People laughed with their mouths completely open, but their eyes entirely dead. They drank champagne from fragile glasses, spilling drops onto the cedar floor without a second glance. And then she saw him. Edmund, the Duke of Carlisle. He wasn't hard to spot, mostly because he looked like a man standing at his own execution. He was stationed near the massive marble fireplace, a tall, broad-shouldered figure crammed into a severely tailored black tailcoat. His cravat was tied so tightly, Florence thought it might cut off his circulation. He wasn't smiling. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, staring into the crowd with an expression of such profound, exhausted contempt that Florence felt a sudden, bizarre spark of kinship. He didn't look aristocratic, not really. His jaw was square and dark, with a 5 o'clock shadow that his valet had clearly failed to shave close enough. He looked rough. He looked like a man who wanted to punch his fist through the imported cedar floorboards and walk out into the rain. Herrick tapped his music stand twice. Florence tore her eyes away from the Duke and placed her hands on the keys. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. She began to play. It was a standard, utterly pedestrian waltz. The chords were simple, the melody predictable. Her fingers moved entirely on muscle memory, striking the slightly flat keys with mechanical precision. She didn't need to read the sheet music. She had played this exact piece in a dozen different ballrooms, for a dozen different crowds of rich people who never once looked in her direction. The dancers filled the floor. The rustle of their skirts sounded like dead leaves dragging across pavement. Florence stared blankly at the polished mahogany of the piano lid, letting her mind detach from her body. Her stomach cramped sharply. She hadn't eaten since a bruised apple at dawn. The smell of roasted pheasant drifted in from the adjacent dining hall, rich and savory, making her mouth water and her head throb. Just play, she told herself. 3 shillings. Rent is due on Tuesday. She played. For 45 minutes she was nothing more than a machine, a mechanism of bone and tendon, striking wood and wire. The room spun in a blur of color and noise. The heat grew worse. A drop of sweat traced a cold path down her spine, pooling at the tightest band of her corset. She looked up again, her hands still pumping out the relentless 3/4 time. The Duke had moved. He was closer to the dais now, trapped in a conversation with a dowager drowning in purple satin. Florence watched his hands. He was turning a heavy gold signet ring, round and round on his finger. The skin around his knuckles was pale, strained. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze snapped directly to the piano. Not to the ensemble, not to Herrick, to her. His eyes were a flat, dark gray. There was no polite distance in them. They were angry, bored, and desperate. He looked exactly how Florence felt. Something in Florence's chest tightened. A sudden, irrational surge of spite flared in her throat. She looked down at her hands, churning out the same, sickeningly sweet, mind-numbing melody. She hated it. She hated the dress she was wearing. She hated the smell of the room. And she suddenly, violently hated the song. Her left hand twitched. It wasn't a conscious decision. It started as a physical rebellion, a cramp of frustration in her left pinky finger. Instead of striking the standard bass octave on the first beat of the measure, her hand shifted down half a step. Clang. The dissonance was sharp, a muddy, ugly sound that cut through the polite harmony like a butcher's knife through silk. Herrick's head whipped around, his eyes wide with panic. He mouthed something frantic, waving his hand to correct her. Florence meant to correct it. She really did. She needed the 3 shillings. But as her right hand came down to play the sweet, resolving chord of the melody, she looked out at the floor. A young lord, in a blue coat, stepped on his partner's dress, ripping the delicate lace. He didn't apologize. He just laughed, a braying, arrogant sound that echoed over the music. Florence's jaw clenched. Her right hand froze for a microsecond. Then, instead of resolving the chord, she mirrored the dissonant bass. She struck a minor 7th. Hard. The piano groaned under the force of her fingers. The vibration shot up her forearms, a sudden jarring shock of energy that made her breath hitch. It felt incredible. She didn't stop. The rigid 1-2-3 rhythm of the waltz remained, but she dragged it down, slowing the tempo just a fraction of a beat. She leaned into the flat middle C, turning the flaw of the instrument into the focal point of the melody. The sweet, lilting waltz warped. It became heavier, darker. The bright, major key cheerfulness shattered. replaced by a brooding, syncopated rhythm that felt less like a dance and more like a march to the gallows. Florence's fingers dug into the keys. She wasn't grazing them anymore, she was attacking them. The tendons in her wrists stood out in sharp relief. 1, 2, 3. She added a rolling, thunderous arpeggio in the left hand, completely drowning out Martin's frantic, confused cello playing. Herrick had stopped waving. He was staring at her, paralyzed, his baton suspended in the air. On the floor, the dancers began to falter. The heavy, dragging tempo made their light, bouncing steps look ridiculous. Couples stumbled against each other. The braying lord in the blue coat stopped moving entirely, looking around with a flushed, bewildered face. The rustle of silk died down, replaced by the scuffing of leather soles as people awkwardly came to a halt. The conversations faded. The laughter stopped. Florence didn't care. The room had narrowed down to the 61 keys in front of her. She was sweating freely now, the damp hair at the nape of her neck sticking to her skin. Her chest heaved against the brutal constraint of the corset. But she hit the keys harder, letting all the cold, the hunger, the petty humiliations of the day pour out through her fingertips. She was dragging the gilded, suffocating ballroom down into the mud with her. She wove a frantic, jagged melody over the dark, rolling bass. It was an improvisation born entirely of spite and exhaustion. It sounded like glass breaking. It sounded like the heavy iron gates of the estate slamming shut. It sounded raw, unpolished, and intensely, uncomfortably alive. She closed her eyes, her head swaying slightly with the violent rhythm. She could smell the dust rising from inside the piano casing, disturbed by the sheer force of the hammers striking the strings. Oh no, she tasted salt on her lips. For the first time all evening, she wasn't cold. Crash. She brought both hands down on a chaotic, diminished chord, let it hold for 2 agonizingly long seconds, and then snapped her hands off the keyboard. Silence slammed into the room. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the ringing, heavy silence that follows a gunshot. Florence sat frozen on the creaking bench, her hands hovering inches above the keys, her fingers trembling violently from the exertion. Her breath was loud in her own ears, ragged and uneven. Slowly the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharp spike of terror. What have I done? She opened her eyes. The entire ballroom was staring at her. 300 faces, pale and frozen, turned toward the dais. No one spoke. No one moved. The braying lord looked horrified. The dowager in purple had a hand pressed to her chest, as if she were experiencing palpitations. Herrick looked like he was about to vomit directly onto his polished shoes. Florence swallowed hard. Her throat was bone dry. The 3 shillings were gone. She would be lucky if Herrick didn't have her arrested for breach of contract or public disturbance. She slowly lowered her hands to her lap, wiping her sweaty palms on the rough fabric of her skirt. She began to calculate how long it would take to walk back to her boarding house if she was thrown out into the street without coat money. Then the crowd parted. They didn't just step aside, they recoiled, drawing their expensive skirts and tails out of the way as a tall figure moved through the center of the room. It was the Duke. Edmund walked toward the dais. He didn't hurry. His strides were long, heavy, and deliberate. His boots struck the imported cedar with a hard, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo the dark waltz she had just destroyed. Florence gripped the edge of the piano bench. Her instinct was to stand up, to apologize, to shrink into the submissive posture expected of a hired servant who had just ruined a duke's party. But her legs felt like lead, and the lingering fire of the music was still burning a hole in her chest. She stayed seated, her chin tilting up defensively. He stopped at the edge of the dais, towering over the piano. Up close, the physical reality of him was overwhelming. He smelled of starch, expensive brandy, and something sharper beneath it, sweat and cold iron. The harsh overhead light caught the fine, angry lines around his eyes and the tension in his heavy jaw. He looked down at her, the silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. Herrick finally broke it, scrambling forward, his hands clasped together in a pathetic knot. "Your Grace, I beg your profound forgiveness. The girl is ill, a fever perhaps, a hysterical fit. I assure you she will be dismissed immediately. We will resume with—" "Shut up," Edmund said. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He spoke the words with a flat, quiet authority that made Herrick's mouth snap shut with an audible click. Edmund didn't look at the ensemble leader. His dark, gray eyes were locked onto Florence. Florence felt a bead of sweat roll down her temple. She met his gaze, refusing to look away, though her heart was battering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Let him fire me," she thought. "Just let him do it quickly so I can leave." "What was that?" Edmund asked. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like he hadn't spoken in days. Florence swallowed the dryness in her throat. "A waltz, Your Grace." "Don't play games with me," he said, stepping onto the dais. The wood groaned under his weight. He was close enough now that she could see the slight fraying on the edge of his immaculate cravat, a tiny imperfection in the armor of his wealth. That was not Strauss. That was not anything written on that page. He jabbed a thick finger at the sheet music resting on the stand. "I made an error in the bass line," Florence lied, her voice remarkably steady, despite the shaking in her hands. "I attempted to correct it, but the instrument is out of tune at middle C. It threw off the progression." Edmund stared at her. For a moment she thought he was going to strike her, the muscles in his jaw locked, jumping beneath the skin. "You're a liar," he said softly. Florence's temper, already frayed to breaking point by hunger and exhaustion, finally snapped. The sheer arrogance of him, standing there in clothes worth more than her life, calling her a liar when she was trying to salvage her miserable livelihood. "If Your Grace is dissatisfied with the performance," Florence said, her voice dropping to a harsh, cold register, "you are welcome to dismiss me. I will collect my wages from the steward and depart." She reached forward and snatched her sheet music off the stand, rolling it up with a violent twist of her wrists. "I didn't say I was dissatisfied," Edmund said. Florence froze, the rolled-up paper halfway to her lap. She looked up at him, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Edmund turned his head, looking back over his shoulder at the frozen, staring crowd of aristocrats. The contempt on his face was naked now, a raw, ugly thing. He hated them. Florence saw it with sudden, absolute clarity. He hated the heat, the perfume, the polite, empty noise. He was suffocating in this room just as much as she was, only his cage was made of gold and cedar. He turned back to her. He reached into his waistcoat pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out a heavy gold sovereign. With a flick of his thumb, he tossed the coin onto the polished lid of the broadwood. It hit the wood with a sharp clack, spun in a blur of gold, and settled flat, gleaming under the chandelier light. A sovereign, 20 shillings, almost a month's rent. Florence stared at the coin. Her mouth went dry. "Play it again," Edmund said. Florence looked from the coin to his face. "Play what?" "Whatever the hell that was," he said, leaning closer. The smell of brandy and iron washed over her. "The ugly thing, the heavy thing. Play it again." "The dancers won't be able to follow it," Florence said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund's lips curled into a fraction of a smile. It was a bleak, humorless expression. "I know," he said. "That's the point." He stepped back from the piano, crossing his arms over his chest, standing like a sentinel between her and the horrified crowd. He nodded once, an order. Florence looked down at the keys. Her hands were still trembling, but the pain in her knuckles was gone, replaced by a rushing, electric heat. She glanced at the gold coin resting on the mahogany. She thought of the cold mud outside, the damp walls of her room, the dragging, endless monotony of the 1, 2, 3. She placed her hands back on the keys. She found the flat middle C. She found the dissonant bass chord. She took a deep breath, feeling the whalebone corset dig into her ribs one last time, and then she brought her hands down, hard, clang. The dark waltz ripped through the ballroom a second time. Behind her, she heard the frantic, scandalized whispering of the crowd. She heard Herrick whimpering in despair, but right in front of her, standing in the shadow of the grand piano, the Duke of Carlisle closed his eyes, let out a long, slow breath, and finally unclenched his fists. She played the ugly thing again, and this time she did not hold back. Florence dug her fingers into the heavy ivory keys, treating the Broadwood Grand not as a delicate instrument of high society, but as an anvil. The music was a jagged, relentless tide. It stripped away the polite veneer of the waltz, exposing the mechanical, repetitive grind beneath. The tempo was slow, bruising and heavy. Every time she struck the diminished chords, the sound reverberated against the imported cedar floorboards, vibrating upward through the soles of her damp boots. Her shoulders ached with a dull, burning intensity. The rigid whalebone corset dug mercilessly into her lower ribs, restricting her lung capacity so severely that she had to take shallow, jagged breaths through her teeth. She tasted copper. She tasted the stale gin from the tavern across the street from her boarding house. She tasted the bitter, undeniable reality of her own life, pouring it entirely into the flat, middle sea. The reaction of the crowd was not immediate. Aristocrats, Florence had learned long ago, possessed a delayed response to genuine discomfort. They were conditioned to ignore unpleasantness, to gracefully sidestep the grotesque. But this could not be sidestepped. The ballroom began to empty, piece by piece, sound by sound. The initial shock, a collective sharply drawn intake of breath, like a bellows sucking in the stale, perfumed air. The indignant retreat, the aggressive rustling of heavy silk skirts and stiff velvet as the dowagers and young debutantes turned their backs. The final rejection. The heavy, successive thuds of the massive oak double doors swinging shut as the guests poured out into the grand hallway, demanding their coats, demanding their carriages, demanding distance from the hideous noise. Through it all, Martin the cellist had quietly packed his instrument and fled down the servants' stairwell. Herrick, weeping silently and clutching his baton to his chest like a dying child, had scurried out behind a potted fern. Florence was alone on the dais. She kept playing. She played until the chaotic noise of the departing crowd faded into the muted, distant crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive outside. She played until the hundreds of wax tapers in the crystal chandeliers began to burn down, their flames guttering and smoking, filling the cavernous room with the sharp, acrid scent of burnt wick and melting tallow. Finally, her left hand cramped. A sharp, unavoidable spasm shot up her forearm. Her fingers slipped off the keys, striking a harsh, accidental dissonance that echoed through the vast, empty room. She let her hands drop to her lap. She bowed her head, her chest heaving against the stiff fabric of her faded navy dress. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. It was heavy, ringing in her ears, pressing against her temples. "They're gone," a voice said. Florence flinched, her head snapping up. In the sheer physical exertion of the performance, she had forgotten he was there. Edmund, the Duke of Carlisle, had not moved. He was still standing in the shadow of the piano, his arms crossed over his chest. His black tailcoat absorbed the dying light of the chandeliers. The severe, perfect knot of his cravat had been pulled loose, the stark white fabric hanging limply against his throat. The 5 o'clock shadow on his jaw looked darker now, rougher. He did not look like a duke in his ancestral home. He looked like a man standing in the ruins of a burning building, casually watching the smoke rise. "I ruined your evening, Your Grace," Florence said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of all the polite, deferential polish she usually employed with employers. She was too exhausted to pretend anymore. "My evening was ruined the moment the first guest arrived," Edmund replied. His voice was low, scraping against the silence of the room. He uncrossed his arms and stepped closer to the piano. He reached out, his large hand brushing against the mahogany lid. You simply hastened the conclusion. For that, I suppose I should thank you. Florence stared at him. She looked for the mockery, the condescension, the cruel amusement that usually accompanied a wealthy man speaking to a poor woman. She found none. His gray eyes were flat, tired, and entirely serious. They will talk, Florence pointed out, her fingers absent-mindedly rubbing the sore knuckles of her left hand. They will say you lost your mind. They will say you hired a madwoman to insult them. Let them say whatever they please. Edmund moved past the piano, walking toward a small side table laden with crystal decanters. He picked up a heavy square bottle of amber liquid. He didn't bother with a glass. He pulled the glass stopper out with his teeth, spat it into his palm, and took a long, slow pull directly from the bottle. Florence watched the muscles in his throat work. The scent of sharp, aged brandy drifted across the distance between them, cutting through the smell of burnt wax. He lowered the bottle, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Do you know how much this house cost to build? He asked, not looking at her. The cedar floors, the marble from Italy, the silk on the walls. More than I could conceptualize, Florence answered honestly. It cost my grandfather his soul, my father his sanity, and it is currently costing me my will to live, Edmund said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. He turned to look at her. Every person in this room tonight was a parasite. They come here to drink my wine, scorch my floors, and judge the quality of my hospitality, all while plotting how to extract favors, money, or land from my estate. It is a pantomime, a deeply, profoundly exhausting pantomime. He walked slowly back to the dais, holding the bottle by its neck. He stopped a few feet from her, looking down at the heavy gold sovereign still resting on the piano lid. And then you played that, he said softly. It was an accident, at first, Florence admitted. The admission felt strange on her tongue. The truth was not something she usually traded in. The piano is flat, middle C. I know it is flat. It has been flat for 3 years. I refused to let the tuner in to fix it. Florence blinked, thrown off balance. Why? Because it annoyed my mother, Edmund said smoothly, a ghost of a bitter smile touching the corner of his mouth. She hated imperfect things. I find perfection to be deeply suspicious. He gestured toward the gold coin. Take it. Florence looked at the sovereign. It gleamed in the dim light. She needed it. Rent, coal, food. The coin represented a month of survival. But a cold, stubborn knot of pride tightened in her throat. I didn't earn it, she said, her voice tight. I broke my contract. I drove your guests away. Herrick will likely refuse to pay me my 3 shillings, let alone. She gestured vaguely to the gold. Edmund's jaw set. The bitter amusement vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense focus. He stepped onto the dais, the wood groaning under his boots. He closed the distance between them until he was standing directly over her. Florence refused to shrink back. She tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze. Do not insult me with false humility, Edmund said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You did not play that music by accident. You played it because you were angry. You played it because you looked around this room and saw the exact same hollow, pathetic farce that I see every single day. You played the truth. He reached out and picked up the coin. He held it out to her, pinching it between his thumb and forefinger. I am not paying you for a waltz, he said. I am paying you because for 10 minutes this house finally sounded exactly the way it feels. Florence stared at the gold coin, then up at his face. The smell of the damp wool of her own dress mixed with the rich starch of his shirt. She saw the absolute, bone-deep exhaustion in his eyes. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a fairy tale prince. He was a man drowning in a very expensive ocean. And he had just realized that she knew how to swim in the dark. Slowly, her aching, blistered fingers reached out. The rough skin of her fingertips brushed against the smooth, cold gold of the sovereign. She took it. It was heavy. "Thank you, Your Grace," she murmured, her voice stripped of all pretense. "Edmund," he corrected quietly. He took a step back, the intense proximity breaking, letting the cold air of the room rush back in between them. "Return on Tuesday." Florence paused, her hand closing tightly around the coin. "Tuesday for what?" "To play," Edmund said, turning his back and walking toward the dark, empty expanse of the ballroom. "I will ensure the Middle Sea remains exactly as it is." Tuesday morning brought a relentless, driving London rain. It was the kind of rain that didn't just wet the skin but seeped directly into the joints. Florence stood at the massive wrought-iron gates of the Carlisle estate. She was not wearing the faded navy silk dress. The corset was gone, left in a crumpled, hateful heap on the floor of her boarding house room. Instead, she wore a heavy, practical wool skirt, a sensible linen blouse, and a thick, slightly moth-eaten gray shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her boots were sensible. Her hair was tied back in a harsh, unforgiving knot at the nape of her neck. She looked exactly like what she was, a working-class woman from Cheapside who survived on weak tea and stubbornness. The footman at the front door stared at her with open, undisguised disdain. He looked her up and down, taking in the mud on her boots and the dampness of her shawl. "The tradesman's entrance is around the back," the footman said, his nose crinkling as if she smelled of fish. "The Duke is expecting me," Florence said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the trembling insecurity she had felt on Friday night. The heavy weight of the gold sovereign in her pocket had bought her a temporary, but profound, sense of audacity. The footman scoffed. "His Grace does not receive—" "Let her in, Bates." The voice echoed from the cavernous marble foyer behind the footman. Edmund walked into the light. He looked drastically different from the night of the ball. He was not wearing a tailcoat or a cravat. He wore simple, dark trousers and a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing thick, corded forearms dusted with dark hair. He looked tired. He held a cup of black coffee, the steam rising in lazy spirals around his face. The footman's spine snapped rigidly straight. "Yes, Your Grace. Forgive me." He stepped aside quickly, opening the heavy door wider. Florence stepped over the threshold. The contrast between the damp, freezing street and the dry, quiet luxury of the manor was jarring. Her wet boots squeaked against the polished Italian marble. She felt distinctly out of place, a rough stone dropped onto a velvet cushion. Edmund didn't offer a polite greeting. He simply turned and began walking down the long, portrait-lined corridor. Florence followed, her wet skirts heavy around her ankles. He led her not to a parlor or a drawing room, but straight back to the ballroom. In the daylight, the room looked entirely different. It was vast, empty, and intimidating. The massive windows were uncurtained, letting in the gray, watery light of the rainstorm. The crystal chandeliers hung above them like dead, frozen spiders. The air was cold, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old wood. There was no fire in the grate. The broad wood piano sat exactly where she had left it on the raised dais, looking lonely in the sheer scale of the room. "It's quiet," Florence observed, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. "The servants are instructed to avoid this wing on Tuesdays," Edmund said. He walked over to the piano, setting his coffee cup down on a nearby side table. He didn't look at her. He stared out the tall windows at the driving rain. "I hate the noise of them cleaning, the sweeping, the polite little coughs. It drives me mad." Florence walked slowly toward the dais. She ran her hand over the polished edge of the piano lid. It felt cold beneath her palm. "Why did you ask me to come back?" she asked. The question hung in the vast, empty air, echoing slightly against the cedar floorboards. Edmund turned from the window. He looked at her, his gaze traveling over her simple wool skirt, the moth-eaten shawl, the lack of corsetry. He noted the change, but he didn't comment on it. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, analyzing intelligence. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who are paid to lie to me," Edmund said quietly. He leaned his hip against the edge of the piano, crossing his arms. "My stewards lie about the estate's finances to keep me complacent. My peers lie about their affections to secure my influence. The women I am introduced to lie about their personalities to secure my title. Everyone is playing a part. Everyone is playing the waltz." He looked down at the keys. "On Friday night, you were the first person in this house in 5 years to do something genuinely, completely honest. It was ugly, it was hostile, and it was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." Florence felt a strange, tight, pulling sensation in her chest. It wasn't romance, it was recognition. "I am not a composer, Your Grace," Florence said, her voice defensively sharp. "I am a working musician. I play what I am paid to play." Friday was a lapse in judgment brought on by hunger and a bad corset. "I don't know how to write music. I only know how to read it." "I am not asking you to write music," Edmund countered smoothly. He uncrossed his arms and picked up a heavy, leather-bound ledger from the side table. He tossed it onto the piano bench. Florence looked at it. It was thick, the pages worn. "What is this?" "My estate ledgers," Edmund said, his voice hardening. "The records of the Carlyle family, rent collections from starving tenant farmers in Yorkshire, foreclosures on widows in London, political bribes passed off as charitable donations. It is the accounting of how this house, and my entire life, is funded." Florence looked from the ledger to his face. "I don't understand." "I have to read them today," Edmund said, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The vulnerability in his voice was sudden and striking. "I have to sit in this room, read these numbers, and sign my name at the bottom, knowing exactly what it means. Knowing the blood that pays for the marble you are standing on." He stepped closer to her, the scent of, sharp coffee and clean linen enveloping her. "I cannot do it in silence," he said, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "The silence makes it too real. But if I hire a normal musician, they will play Mozart. They will play something cheerful and light, and the contradiction will make me want to tear the strings out of the instrument." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another heavy gold sovereign. He placed it gently on top of the leather ledger. "Play the ugly thing, Florence," Edmund said softly. "Play the anger. Play the frustration. Play the dirt and the rain and the cold. Play exactly what this world actually feels like, so that I do not have to sit here and pretend it is something else." Florence looked at the ledger, at the gold coin, and then at the man standing before her. He was wealthy, privileged, and powerful, but as she looked at the tight, defensive line of his shoulders and the exhaustion etched into his features, she realized he was just as trapped by the mechanics of the world as she was. His cage was just heavily gilded. She reached out and picked up the gold sovereign. She didn't say thank you this time. She just slipped it into the deep pocket of her wool skirt. She turned and sat down on the piano bench. She pushed the ledger aside, making room for her hands. She adjusted her posture, feeling a profound, liberating relief at the absence of the whalebone corset. She could breathe. She could move. She placed her hands over the keys. She didn't look for sheet music. There was none. She found the flat middle C. She pressed it down, letting the slightly off-key note ring out into the cold, damp air of the ballroom. It sounded lonely, but it sounded real. Behind her, she heard the heavy scrape of a wooden chair. She heard the soft thud of Edmund sitting down at the side table. She heard the rustle of the ledger pages turning. Florence closed her eyes. She felt the chill of the room, the dampness in her boots, the lingering ache in her knuckles. She gathered it all up, the cynical, exhausting reality of simply trying to survive, and she pushed it down into her fingertips. She began to play. It was not a waltz. It was a slow, marching dirge of heavy bass notes and jagged, unpredictable melodies. It was dark, it was imperfect, and it was entirely her own. She did not play to please. She played to survive, and as the dissonant chords filled the massive, empty room, wrapping around the quiet sounds of the Duke of Carlisle, turning the pages of his family's sins, Florence finally felt warm. Did Florence and Edmund's unconventional rebellion strike a chord with you? We want to hear your thoughts on this raw, unspoken connection in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark twist on historical romance, please hit the like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more grounded, emotional tales. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for watching and listening with us tonight.